Okay, so was Hans Asperger a Nazi? Can we still say Asperger Syndrome? What is going on? What's the truth behind everything? And I'm here to unravel the whole thing, so don't go anywhere. Hey guys, just a note before we get started with this video. This is all about Hans Asperger and the potential of his collusion with the Nazi-era Germany in Vienna. And I just want to say that I do talk about certain things that are in the document that may be sensitive to some of you. So if you are not comfortable watching and understanding stuff about the Second World War and stuff like that, please turn away, turn this off right now. And I mean no harm by this video. It's literally just an analysis of a report. So let's get into it. Okay, peace. Hey guys, welcome back to TheAspieWorld. If anybody knows me, then I'm an autism advocate. I have autism and ADHD myself, and I make weekly videos all about this stuff. So if you're new around here and you're enjoying this type of video, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below to make sure you don't miss a video. Okay, so before I get into this, I want to be completely clear. I am in no way, shape, or form advocating for any racial hatred or anything like that at all to do with Hans Asperger or anything like that. I'm just literally talking about the documents and stuff that came out about it, and I'll get into why that is, or potentially an issue right now. So, back in the 1980s, a woman called Lorna Wing, who is an autism researcher, coined the term Asperger Syndrome to characterize certain autistic individuals who had more lower support needs, right? Or used to be called high functioning. They kind of don't use those labels anymore because people felt quite offended by those things, and people generally just want to make people feel good and happy about themselves, so they didn't carry on using those terms. So be it, Asperger Syndrome was the term. Now, this was named after research and papers that had been published by a guy called Hans Asperger. Now, Hans Asperger was a guy who was from Vienna, so he lived in Austria for many, many years. Obviously, he was born and raised there, but he worked in Austria during the Nazi takeover, or the Nazi-era takeover of Austria during the Second World War. So this is kind of, he's a clinical psychologist, or a doctor of clinical psychology, working in this field, and he was doing a lot of stuff with the, autism research. He actually was one of the founding people to really put research in, or a lot of research into autism and that kind of stuff. And we know this because it's documented in people's books like Steve Silverman, who documents Hans Asperger's research, and it was, key to understanding autism and the idea of clinical psychology related to autism. Now, Hans Asperger had lots of haters. He had loads of people who were not massive fans of him anyway. But needless to say, this is where the name Asperger Syndrome came from. Now, in 2013, the DSM, and then again in 2019, the IDC, which is these two ways of clinically diagnosing neurological disorders, mental health disorders, they took the term Asperger Syndrome out of this system of diagnosis for autism because they felt like people who were diagnosed with Asperger Syndrome sometimes, especially in America, weren't legally seen as being autistic, to the point of saying the term autistic on their diagnostic paper, because that would then also give them a bad time trying to access support and help for autism. Even though Asperger Syndrome is part of the autism spectrum disorder, they were kept out of that because the term wasn't completely just autism. So they said, well, why don't we just put all the terms together and say autism spectrum disorder? So it became, from Asperger's, the diagnosis nomenclature became ASD. Now, this doesn't wipe out the fact that you have hundreds and thousands of people who are diagnosed with Asperger's, including myself. I was diagnosed with Asperger Syndrome in 2013, just before the DSM change. Now, because of that, people stopped using the term Asperger Syndrome. Literally, that's all it was. That's the only reason people stopped using the term Asperger Syndrome. Now, in 2018 came I think it was like a 4-year or 8-year study, was studying texts and journals from the archives of Hans Asperger and the kind of occupation of Vienna from the Nazi era, when the Nazis kind of took over Vienna. Because what happened is, obviously, Austria bordering Germany, and they share common heritage. Germany kind of obtained Austria because I don't think Austria had any army at the time, so they just kind of walked in there. Now, this is back in wartime, so it's a very difficult situation to be in. It all starts with this report. Now, I have this article, this report, this paper, whatever you want to call it, it's published. I have it linked down below, so you can check it out for yourself, but I just want to go through some of the stuff. And I'm going to pop on screen here the bits I'm reading out. So it says, this is why the question came around. Limits of educability, Asperger and the Speer-Glerndt euthanasia facility. Now, this is quite interesting to note. In his wartime publications, Asperger appears as someone who declares his willingness to cooperate with the Nazi state, propagated, albeit less enthusiastically than others, elements of Nazi race hygiene, and tried to argue that his discipline has an appropriate role His discipline had an important role to play within the new political order. His main argument was the ability of Halpagogic, I can't say those words, I'm dyslexic, to turn troubled, difficult, or abnormal children into useful members of society. Right, so this is where it gets really interesting. This paper, when it states this point, it's saying that Hans Asperger was able to go along with the status quo within Nazi-occupied Vienna, meaning he told the line or he'd be killed, basically. Because anyone who opposed the Nazi regime, well, we know what happened to them. But it also says here that he was opposed to it. He was not kind of for anything. He actually said here, like, and this is what this article part says. It says that he argued that his discipline, his degree in his doctorate, gave him the ability to say, hey, we can't euthanize, which is basically, kill innocent people. We can't euthanize these kids. We can actually, rehabilitate them into society using kind of different techniques and actually supporting them, right? Which is really interesting. So first off the bat, the reason I'm bringing this up is because there are many people on the internet who say Hans Asperger was a Nazi, that's it, right? I'm like, well, there's no real evidence that Hans Asperger was a Nazi. And one of the things that we can pick out from this just straight off the bat was Hans Asperger was never part of the Nazi Party. He never signed to the Nazi Party. He was part of socialism groups or socialist groups within Nazi-occupied Vienna. None of them were actual Nazis. And you got to remember, in 1940s, 1930s, when the Nazis were occupying Germany, everybody was a socialist in some way in terms of, because the Nazis weren't really socialists, the Nazis were kind of totalitarian, but in the terms of socialism, Nazi means Socialist Party of Germany, Nazi Party of Germany. But everybody was, because you had this Great Depression that everyone were recovering from. And so Hans Asperger was for a lot of the social policies, kind of like, we have National Health Service here in the UK, we have, army and police force and public libraries and public schools. They're all socialist ideologies. So to be part of socialism was not a bad thing, and it never really has been a bad thing. It's just when Nazis overrode the idea of being a socialist and turned it into totalitarianism, then it became a problem, or fascism, as it was later kind of coined in Germany at the time. So there's another article here, it's really interesting. Maria Asperger Felder published a nuanced portrait of her father, not shying away from his possible involvement in National Socialism, however adding significant new fact, citing Schrimmer, Daniel Kondzila in 2009's paper on 30 neurological eponyms associated with the Nazi era included Asperger along with the physicians with ambivalent roles because he had been accused on uncertain grounds of harbouring sympathy for Nazi politics, while he had also cautiously defended mentally disabled children. Now this is interesting. What they're saying there is that Hans Asperger was saying that he sympathized is a very interesting word to use. He was towing the line. He wasn't opposing the Nazi takeover of his hospital and all that kind of stuff. There's not much he could do anyway. But then they say, he also did defend mentally disabled children. Now, what Hans Asperger was noted for, and Steve Stillman says this in his book, Neurotribes, Hans Asperger was actually a humanitarian, and he was the guy who was saying that, these disabled children shouldn't be euthanized. I mean, this guy was advocating against it. Now, there's only one case where Asperger's name appears on any document to do with euthanasia and that bizarre hospital that I can't pronounce, where there was a case of a little girl who was profoundly disabled, global learning delay and all kinds of stuff. And this young girl was only, maybe 2 or 3 years old, was sent to this euthanasia clinic because of this racial cleansing or just ethnic cleansing, which we were doing in Germany at the time, which is horrible, right? Hans Asperger worked in this clinic where patients came in to first, and then the Nazis would take them to different places, concentration camps or euthanasia clinics or whatever. So Hans Asperger clinic was just a normal clinic, right? Just where people would go to be assessed. And he never once said, I want this person to go here. He just worked in the clinic. So the paper with his name on it is just literally because that's his clinic. He really had no say in who went to a gas chamber and who didn't. What he did have a say in, though, is his human right to say, hey, this is wrong. And actually, it's recorded on several occasions that Hans Asperger was actually arrested by the Gestapo. Now, the Gestapo are the secret service police of the Nazis. And he was taken away on several occasions because he opposed the Nazi regime. Now, there are two things, you can oppose the Nazi regime until a certain point, where your life gets threatened. And this is something to bear in mind. Everybody in Nazi Vienna was like, oh my God, like, what do we do? We have to toe the line somewhat to get on. So that's worth noting. Okay, here we go. The author qualified the affirmative references to Nazi ideology in some of Asperger's papers as a deliberate tactic to deceive the Nazis about his true intentions, namely protect his patients. So Hans Asperger, this is saying that, and this is from the article, everything I'm talking about is taken from this study. Hans Asperger actually was protecting his patients. He was pretending to go along with what the Nazis said in terms of sign this paper, be a part of that kind of policy, sign this license. But all in all, Hans Asperger was always protecting his patients. He put his patients first every single time, and that's clearly documented and clearly stated in everything above all else. Another screenshot. Steve Silverman's 2015 book, Neurotribes, written for a general audience, also pushed the narrative of Asperger as an Oskar Schindler-like protector of children with autism. One of Asperger's alleged strategies was that he initially highlighted his most promising case to deflect the wrath of the Nazis, which basically means that Hans Asperger was doing everything he could to stop children going to euthanasia clinics or any other kind of horrible stuff going on in Nazi Vienna. George Frankl, a close collaborator of Hans Asperger, left Vienna for the United States in 1937, going on to work with Leo Kanner. Now, this is really interesting. Leo Kanner published works at the same time, 1942. At the same time as Asperger published his work on autism, Leo Kanner also published work on autism, right, in 1942. Now, Leo Kanner also coined terms like refrigerator mothers, and it was mother's fault the kids were autistic, but he also came up with, they called it Kanner infantile autism, then he changed it to just infantile autism, and then it came just autism, right? So Kanner was a big player in autism and research. However, this article here, if we go back to the article, it states, especially 167 to 8 to 180, this information reviewed earlier suspicions that Kanner had known about Asperger's work before his own publications on the topic, based on the fact that Asperger had already mentioned autistic psychopathy in a 1938 publication, years before his more widely known postdoctoral thesis, and that the Austrian-born Kanner had access to German-language medical publications, basically stating that Leo Kanner and George Frankl actually obtained information from Hans Asperger to kind of publish it as their own. And if you think about this, if someone's going to try and publish work that's yours, and then you come out and say, hey, that's my work, and you weren't the first person to think of it, the best thing to do would be to smear their name. Now, just bear that in mind. We'll read the rest of this, and I'm not defending anybody here. I'm just giving literally state facts and adding my opinion in as I go. This is a screenshot from basically it's a questionnaire from 1940. Asperger reported several memberships organizations affiliated with Nazi parties. He refrained, however, from joining the Nazi party itself. So he joined certain different kind of organizations within German-occupied Vienna at the time, which is notable because obviously it's what's going on. You're going to have to toe the line. So I'm giving all stating all the facts. Despite these associations, there is no indication that Asperger actively sympathized with the Nazi movement prior to 1938. And like many of his colleagues, rather, the evidence points to an ambivalent attitude, potential obstacle to his supporting National Socialism, where his religious convictions, his humanist background, and his elitist cultivated habits. Furthermore, following the ban of the Austrian Nazi Party in 1933, the movement remained attractive only to a core of ideological hard supporters, whereas for mere sympathizers or opportunists, the risk of adherence for outweighing potential advantages. Nevertheless, Asperger's record of organizational affiliation over the years prior to 1938 suggested that there was more common ideological ground than has previously been acknowledged. Asperger's political socialization in Neuland likely blinded him to National Socialism's destructive character due to the affinity with core ideological movements. In 1974, Asperger himself put it in this way: the National Socialist time arrived, whereupon it was clear from my previous life that one could well go along with many, let's say, quote-unquote, national things, but not with the inhumane ones, which is exactly what I was saying. When you look at socialism, Hans Asperger was part of things like, wanting to feed people. The Nazis fed 5 million German people who were out of work during the Great Depression. So you can see how people would be attracted to helping other people, especially if you're a humanist, right? So this is kind of saying that, not saying that he was directly in with all the Nazi stuff. Of course he wasn't, that's what it's saying. So this, The strongest claim to the effect that Asperger was an attractive opponent of the Nazis and that he had risked his life defending the children in his care is based on an episode reported in Adam Feinstein's book on the pioneers of autism research. Allegedly, the Gestapo twice came to the clinic to arrest Asperger, either because of his 1938 talk or because he had refused to hand over patients to the officials. The only known source of this claim comes from Asperger himself, who mentioned the incidents in 1962 and his inauguration as the Vienna chair of pediatricians, and in the above-cited 1974 interview. It is totally inhumane, as we saw with dreadful consequence when people accepted the concept of worthless life. This is Asperger himself saying this. He knew my attitude but protected me with his whole being, and for that I have great respect. So this is the only recorded instance that anyone could find anywhere which Asperger publicly mentioned the Nazi euthanasia, despite the fact that this was such an incisive event for his field and its patients. According to this account, the Gestapo was after Asperger because he refused to report patients with certain deficiencies to the Vienna Public Health Office. So again, more evidence saying that Hans Asperger was protecting these people, right? Now there's this national document here that I'm showing you right on the screen now. So despite Asperger's Catholic orientation, the Nazi Party authorities considered Asperger to be apolitical, irreproachable, and as someone who was in conformity with the National Socialist racial and sterilization laws. Now, this is really interesting. He had to sign this document, which is the National Socialist racial and sterilization laws, which basically means that the Nazis were trying to sterilize people from having offspring if you were, disabled or if you were a certain race, which is completely awful. But Hans Asperger had to sign this to practice medicine or practice his psychiatry within that hospital. How could he protect other people if he hadn't signed this thing? And I guess that's what they're saying. Like he signed this thing, and that's what it was. Okay, next. Did Asperger belong to a circle of supporters? Bustines does not mention Asperger, and interestingly, Asperger did not mention the episode even in instances where he was trying to establish his anti-Nazi credentials. Now, this is referring to other people who talk about Nazi groups, Nazi social circles, all that kind of stuff. Asperger was never part of those things, and they're saying he actively opposed those things publicly, and is stated in many people's books, which is really interesting. He also mentioned that he had committed himself to working for the Hitler Youth. Now, Hitler Youth was started way before the Nazis became this horrible kind of thing, right? And the Hitler Youth was part of this National Socialism thing. So I'm not entirely sure where that comes in, but it could mean that he's nasty. I don't know. I'm giving you guys the facts here, but that's something that he did do. Most likely, Asperger took the decision in order to protect and further his career by foregoing the Nazi Party membership. He chose a middle path between keeping his distance from the regime and outright alignment. So he tried to, be involved so it looked like he was towing the line so he wouldn't get killed. He could still protect all those people, but he was just doing what he could to protect his patients, right? Asperger's case file also demonstrates how he tried to prove his loyalty. Beginning in 1938, he took to signing his diagnostic report with Heil Hitler, which is an awful symbolic thing of Hitler. A merely symbolic but revealing gesture. Now, this is really sticky. I don't know where I stand on this. Hans Asperger signing things with Heil Hitler is downright ludicrous, unless this is the only thing that could happen, is that he was put under pressure. You could be signing your documents, you're in Nazi Vienna, if you didn't write Heil Hitler on something. I don't know, I'm just putting speculation. I'd love to know your comments, and so please comment along as we go. At the time of the Nazis take over Austria, two 13-year-old Jewish boys, Alfred S. and Walter Buchner, were patients at the ward. Alfred's file contains no evidence that he was treated in any different way from the other children, and this is within Asperger's clinic, which is really interesting. He had no issues with race or Jews or anything like that. And I want to make a big statement here. People, especially about arguments with people saying that, to use the term Asperger's syndrome is insensitive to Romani Gypsies or, Romani Gypsy descent or Romani descent and Jewish people. Well, I am Romani descent. My grandmother was Romani. So, and I use the term Asperger's, and I'm not offended by it because it's just a name. Even if Hans Asperger did all these horrible Nazi things, I don't think that name is for him. I think that name is for us as a community, but that's just my personal opinion on it. Let's keep moving on here. We've got a few more screenshots to go. Okay, as far as the written record is concerned, there is no indication that Asperger was guided by personal animosity towards Jews. There you go. Asperger repeated this motive of responsible cooperation with the Nazi race hygiene in later writings. We will see shortly that these tasks detailed and how he handled them in the context of his own work. In his lectures, he went on to specify how the sterilization law should be implemented with regards to the children who had features opposed in nearly every way to the high-functioning autistic type described for the first time in the paper. Now, this is basically saying that Hans Asperger was saying these people should be sterilized or killed. In terms of the idea of the race hygiene does not mean deceased, right? It doesn't mean killing people. It actually means sterilizing people. Now, there is something similar that happens if people are pregnant. You can do a test to see if the baby has Down syndrome, right? And if the baby has Down syndrome, you can have the option to terminate that baby, which is basically along the lines of this type of hygiene idea. And then there's another kind of very controversial idea where you have somebody who's profoundly disabled, right? Especially females who are profoundly disabled. And their carers or parents or guardians will have them sterilized because, you may be in a country where, rape and sexual abuse is something that's rampant, and you can have a pregnant, heavily disabled person, which is a bad situation to be in. So you can see how this relating to anything the Nazis do is horrible, because the Nazis are doing it for awful things, but Hans Asperger may have been trying to toe the line. I don't know. I'm literally just putting it out there. I'm showing parallels here. And this, again, is in the 1940s, right? So interesting to know. These children are intellectually below average, including to the degree of feeble-mindedness, whereby with intelligence, we mean abstract intelligence, where particular reason, in short, everything that has to do with instinct, including the practical usefulness and the value of character, are much better developed in relevant terms. These cases are important, or at least they will be as soon as the law for the prevention of hereditary disease offspring comes into force here. If the physician has to take a decision in such a case, we will not be allowed to do so based solely on a questionnaire or the intelligence quotient. Rather, he will base it primarily on his own knowledge of the child's personality, taking into account all of the children's skills in addition to abstract intelligence. So basically, this passage has been quoted as evidence that Hans Asperger tried to publicly protect patients from the forced sterilization. So you can see how, it's conflicting. There's no straight answer here, right? So you can't say one way or another he was sympathizing Nazis or doing all this horrible stuff, because there's no evidence for actually doing it. It's just him towing the line, basically, in terms of political kind of conformity. In his 1944 paper on autism, Asperger reiterated his belief that an individual's possibilities of mental development were primarily determined by the genetic makeup. And people saying thus, Helbedankguk, which is that horrible euthanasia hospital, but that's not it. By saying that someone's determined by the genetic makeup, it's basically saying that, we know that autism is hereditary, right? It comes from your genes. I don't know. Asperger's statement continued to be published in journals controlled by the Nazi loyalists. This is really interesting to know. Everything that Asperger had out publicly was controlled by Nazis, which means that it could have been doctored, edited by Nazis. It was controlled by Nazi loyalists. So you don't know what publicly came out from Asperger was actually from his mouth. Asperger put the spotlight on children at what is often called the high-functioning end of the spectrum, interpreting this as a tactic to protect all children with autistic traits from race hygiene measures. And there you go. Hans Asperger tried his best to make sure that not just, high-functioning autistic people, but every person on the autism spectrum in his care would be protected from race hygiene. Now, guys, I don't know what to make up from this. To me, it seems that it was a difficult time in Vienna, Nazi-occupied. Hans Asperger had no previous history of being horrible or anything towards children, Jews, or anybody. He tried his best in this publication, where it's actually stated, to protect the children. He was arrested by the Gestapo. He was doing everything he can to defend. In, the Heil Hitler thing, again, if your documents are controlled by Nazi loyalists, it's hard to understand. In conclusion, I don't think we should be telling people that they should or shouldn't use the term Aspergers Syndrome. Because if you're diagnosed with it prior to 2013 and you still use that, then that's your choice. We have a day and age where we identify people as they and them, and we should expect that and respect that. And the same with, if somebody wants to identify as Asperger's Syndrome, we should expect that to be, respected. And my stance is, if you want to use the term Asperger's, use it. It doesn't mean that you're a Nazi supporter. And even if Hans Asperger was an evil, horrible person, it doesn't mean that we have to do anything in relation to his work. Now, Asperger was a key role, as Steve Silverman said, in the autism research. Leo Kanner potentially may have taken some of the stuff. And I'd rather say that in this article that you can read down below, the people who were opposed to Hans Asperger were the people who started this 8-year study, or it came from their estate, which is really interesting, because if you're in an opposition to someone, you could potentially want to smear their name. But that's just my intellectual version of my opinion on it. I'd love to know your opinion on it. I don't want this to be a horrible, negative video session. I wanted it to be something that is completely out in the open and open for discussion. Up until this point, we've seen people just saying that Hans Asperger was a Nazi. He was into euthanasia and race hygiene cleansing, and the evidence shows that he really wasn't. It's weird how like it spread like wildfire, even though the people who were on that paper said the opposite about Hans Asperger. So we really need to get the facts right. There's been many YouTubers, some that I used to be friends with, who changed their name from, something Aspie or something, Asperger's to other things because of this whole ridiculous notion of being scared of using the term Asperger's Syndrome. And I don't think we should take that away from anybody. People are free to do what they want, but you need to get your facts right. Don't change it because you think Hans Asperger was a Nazi who killed kids, because there's no evidence of this. Clearly in this paper. This is the paper that everyone refers to, but if you've read it, you would realize that this is not the case. And so I ask you to think about it and discuss and allow people to be free to use what they want. Okay, guys, sorry for the long video. See you in the next one. Peace.